A record-breaking blizzard roared through the city on Christmas Eve, turning the streets into a frozen graveyard. Inside her dark, powerless home, Monica Reed was fighting just to keep her daughter Jasmine warm when a heavy, rhythmic pounding shook her front door. Standing there were 30 shivering members of the Hells Angels, carrying a brother, Frank Donovan, who was bleeding and blue from the cold. Though paralyzed by fear and the judgment of her neighbors, Monica's compassion took over, leading her to open her doors to the outlaws. She had no idea that just 3 days later, the sound of 2,000 roaring motorcycles would descend upon her street, creating a wall of chrome and leather that would shield her family forever. Before we uncover how one night of mercy moved an army, let us know what city you're watching from. And if you believe in the power of a mother's heart, hit that subscribe button. We have more stories of unexpected heroes coming your way tomorrow. The digital clock on the microwave had been dead for hours, but the moonlight reflecting off the snow told Monica it was well past midnight. She sat at her small kitchen table, her fingers tracing the edges of a single $5 bill, the only physical currency she had left in the world. At 34, Monica Reed's face carried the shadows of a decade of hard labor. Her eyes, once bright with the dreams of Monica's hearty soul catering, were now heavy with the dull ache of impending eviction. The house groaned under the weight of the wind, a sound that usually meant a call from her neighbor, Deborah Sloan, complaining about the dilapidated state of the property. But tonight, the neighborhood was silent, buried under 3 feet of ice. In the corner of the kitchen, 5-year-old Jasmine was curled up in a nest of winter coats and tattered quilts near the gas oven. The furnace had breathed its last breath 2 days ago, and Monica had spent her final scraps of wood just to keep the kitchen bearable. As she watched the rhythmic rise and fall of Jasmine's chest, Monica felt a sense of drowning. She was a woman who had spent her life being invisible, a single mother whose small catering business was being strangled by debt and prejudice, completely unaware that in just a few moments, the most feared men in the state would be the ones to finally see her. The gray dawn over Detroit didn't bring light so much as a clearer view of the struggle. Monica Reed stood at her kitchen window, the glass cold enough to ache against her forehead. Outside, the neighborhood was a mosaic of chipped paint and overgrown yards, but Monica's patch of the world felt particularly fragile. Her hands, stained with the faint yellow of turmeric and the scent of onions from a small catering prep the night before, gripped a mug of lukewarm coffee. She was only 34, but in the reflection of the darkened window, she saw the ghost of a woman much older. The vibrancy of her youth had been traded, hour by hour, for the survival of her 5-year-old daughter, Jasmine. Every morning was a silent calculation of loss. As she looked at the stack of past due notices on the counter, notices that felt like predatory birds circling her home, Monica felt the crushing weight of being invisible. To the city, she was a delinquent account number. To the local bank, she was a high-risk liability. To the world at large, she was just another statistic, a single mother treading water in a sea that wanted to pull her under. The only person who seemed to truly see Monica was her neighbor, Deborah Sloan. But Deborah's gaze wasn't one of neighborly concern, it was a weapon. From her impeccably maintained porch across the street, Deborah conducted a silent war of attrition. To Deborah, Monica's presence was a blight on the street's potential value. Every time Monica's aging delivery van backfired, Deborah was there, peering through her blinds, phone likely already in hand to report a noise violation. Every time a customer came to pick up a tray of Monica's signature hearty soul ribs, Deborah would be out on her sidewalk, arms crossed, a physical manifestation of judgment and disdain. Monica watched as Deborah stepped onto her porch to retrieve the morning paper, wrapped in a pristine designer coat that probably cost more than Monica's monthly rent. Deborah paused, her eyes locking onto Monica's window. Even from a distance, the message was clear. You don't belong here. It was a quiet, domestic cruelty that hurt more than the cold. Turning away from the window, Monica looked at Jasmine, who was still asleep under a pile of blankets. The little girl's breathing was the only thing keeping Monica's heart beating. Monica had poured everything into her catering business, hoping her mother's recipes would be the ladder that climbed them out of this hole. But between the rising cost of ingredients and Deborah's constant calls to the health department and zoning board, the ladder was splintering. Monica felt like a ghost haunting her own life, working 3 side jobs just to keep the lights flickering. She was exhausted, isolated, and running out of time, a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the wind to finally push her over. The kitchen, which should have been filled with the aromatic steam of simmering pots and the bustle of Monica's hearty soul, felt unnervingly hollow. The walk-in pantry, once stocked with bulk bags of jasmine rice and crates of fresh produce, was now a cavern of empty shelves. Monica stood before the stove, her movements mechanical as she scraped the bottom of a container of cornmeal. This wasn't a gourmet catering order, it was the final stand against a hungry evening. She moved with the quiet grace of a woman used to making something out of nothing. With practiced hands, she whisked the last bit of oil and a pinch of salt into a pan, the sizzle sounding abnormally loud in the quiet house. Beside her, a single chicken thigh, the very last of her inventory, browned in a small skillet. She had intended to save it for a potential client's tasting, but that client had canceled earlier that afternoon, citing the impending storm. The cancellation had been the final blow, a silent confirmation that the business she had poured her life savings into was effectively dead. Jasmine sat at the small wooden table, swinging her legs, her eyes wide as she watched her mother work. The little girl didn't complain about the small portions or the lack of variety. She simply waited with the patient trust that only a child can possess. Monica felt a sharp pang in her chest as she plated the food. She cut the chicken into tiny pieces, arranging them carefully alongside a small mound of cornbread to make the plate look fuller than it was. "Here you go, baby. A special dinner for my favorite girl," Monica whispered, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. As Jasmine ate, Monica retreated to the counter, pretending to be busy with a stack of invoices. In reality, she was staring at a final notice from the utility company, the numbers blurred before her eyes. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, and her stomach cramped in protest, but she ignored it. Every bite Jasmine took was a victory, but a fleeting one. Monica knew that once this meal was over, there was no plan for tomorrow. The refrigerator hummed a low, dying tune, and the pilot light on the stove flickered, as if reflecting the fading hope in Monica's heart. She had always believed that hard work and good food could save them, but as she looked at her empty cupboards, she realized that flavor couldn't pay the rent, and love couldn't stop the cold. She was officially out of ingredients, out of money, and out of time. The sky didn't just darken, it bruised, turning a heavy, apocalyptic shade of violet before the first flakes began to fall. By nightfall, the wind had graduated from a whistle to a predatory roar, slamming against the sides of the house with enough force to make the floorboards vibrate. This was no ordinary winter dusting. This was the storm of the century, a wall of white that erased the world outside Monica's window. Within hours, the streetlights flickered and died, plunging the neighborhood into an oppressive, velvet blackness. Monica stood in the center of the kitchen, her breath blooming in front of her face like tiny ghosts. The silence that followed the power failure was deafening, broken only by the violent rattling of the window panes. She reached for a flashlight, its beam cutting a weak path through the freezing air. The furnace had let out one final, metallic groan before falling silent, and the heat began to bleed out of the house as if through an open wound. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at her chest, but she pushed it down. She had to be the warmth Jasmine didn't have. She moved through the dark like a shadow, gathering every blanket, coat, and tattered quilt she could find. She dragged a mattress from the bedroom into the kitchen, the smallest room in the house and the only one she could hope to keep somewhat tempered with the gas stove. "Is the sun coming back, Mommy?" Jasmine's voice was small, muffled by the layers of wool Monica had wrapped around her. "Soon, baby. We're just having a winter camp out," Monica lied, her voice trembling as much from the cold as from the fear. She lit the burners on the stove, the blue flames casting eerie, dancing shadows against the walls. It was a dangerous move, one born of desperation, but the alternative was letting the frost claim them before morning. She sat on the edge of the makeshift bed, pulling Jasmine into her lap, trying to transfer her own body heat to her daughter. Outside, the world was being buried. She could hear the heavy thud of snow sliding off the roof and the occasional crack of a tree limb snapping under the weight of the ice. They were completely cut off. No cars could move on the unplowed streets. No emergency services could reach this forgotten corner of the city. As the temperature continued to drop, Monica looked at the frost crystallizing on the inside of the door handle. She felt the isolation of the last few months magnifying, turning into a physical weight. They were trapped in a tomb of ice, two invisible souls in a city that had already turned its back on them. She held Jasmine tighter, whispering old hymns she barely remembered, praying that the walls would hold against the screaming wind that seemed determined to tear their sanctuary apart. The violent pounding on the front door didn't sound like a knock. It sounded like the house was being breached by a battering ram. Monica jumped, her heart leaping into her throat as Jasmine whimpered against her chest. Through the frosted sidelight of the door, she saw a wall of dark, hulking shadows silhouetted against the blinding white of the blizzard. Fear, cold and visceral, rooted her to the spot. She thought of Deborah Sloane's warnings, the reputation of the neighborhood, and the vulnerability of her sleeping child. But then, a voice broke through the howling wind, a desperate, ragged plea that sounded less like a threat and more like a prayer. "Please, we've got a man down. He's freezing to death." Monica's hands shook as she threw back the deadbolt. As the door swung open, a blast of sub-zero air and snow swirled into the foyer, followed by a phalanx of men who looked like they had been forged in a furnace and then dipped in ice. They were massive, clad in heavy leather vests adorned with the Hells Angels insignia, their beards matted with frozen sleet. In the center of the group, two men were half carrying, half dragging a third. This was Frank Donovan. His face was a terrifying shade of ashen gray, and his eyes were rolled back in his head. As they laid him down on her kitchen floor, Monica saw the dark, frozen stains spreading across the side of his leather jacket. Her instinct to flee, to lock herself and Jasmine in the bathroom, collided head-on with a deeper, more ancient drive. She saw the way the other bikers looked at him, not with the bravado of outlaws, but with the raw, naked terror of men watching a brother slip away. He hit a patch of black ice 5 miles back. One of the men rasped, his voice cracking, "We've been walking for an hour." "He stopped shivering, ma'am. That's bad, right?" Monica looked at the man on her floor, then at Jasmine, who was watching from the corner with wide, plate-like eyes. The mistrust that had been her armor for years began to crack. She wasn't a doctor, but she was a mother, and she knew what a body looked like when the spark was fading. "Move him closer to the stove," Monica commanded, her voice regaining a strength she didn't know she still possessed. "Get those wet clothes off him. Jasmine, honey, stay in the corner. Gentlemen, I need every clean towel I have, and the high-proof bourbon from the top shelf. Now." As she knelt beside Frank, pressing her warm hands against his icy neck to find a pulse, the room shifted. The worst nightmare she had imagined just moments ago had been replaced by a group of desperate humans in need of a miracle. Monica realized then that the storm outside was no longer her greatest enemy. It was the ticking clock in Frank's chest, and she was the only one standing between him and the dark. The kitchen, once a place of failed business dreams and lonely calculations, was suddenly alive with a frantic, purposeful energy. Monica didn't have a medical degree, but she had the steady hands of a chef and the survival instincts of a mother. She moved with a decisive speed that left the giant men in leather standing in stunned silence. Jasmine's softest cotton bedsheets were torn into strips for bandages, and the high-proof bourbon, usually reserved for her specialty sauces, became a stinging antiseptic. As she worked on Frank Donovan's side, cleaning the jagged gash he'd taken in the spill, she realized the room had gone quiet. These men, with their tattooed knuckles and intimidating insignias, weren't looking at her with aggression. They were looking at her with a desperate, childlike hope. One of them, a man whose beard was still matted with melting ice, held Frank's hand with a grip so tight his own veins were bulging. He was whispering to his friend, his voice a low, broken rumble that sounded nothing like the roar of an outlaw. In that moment, the monsters Deborah Sloane had always warned her about vanished. In their place were terrified men who loved their brother. Monica's chronic mistrust began to dissolve, replaced by a profound sense of shared humanity. They were all just people trying to survive a storm that didn't care about their reputation. "He stabilized," Monica whispered. her voice cutting through the tension as she finished the final knot on the bandage. The cold actually helps slow the bleeding, but he needs to stay warm. And all of you, you're shivering. She didn't ask if they were hungry, she knew they were. Monica turned to the stove, looking at the meager remnants of her pantry. She took the last of the cornmeal, the remaining withered vegetables, and a bag of soup bones she'd been saving for a rainy day. This was the night of grace. She began to cook, not for a profit or a client, but for the souls huddled in her kitchen. The aroma of garlic and toasted spices began to fight back the smell of damp leather and antiseptic. The bikers began to help, some fetching water from the melting snow outside, others gently moving Jasmine to a safer, warmer corner where she watched them with curious, tired eyes. As the soup simmered, the kitchen transformed. It was no longer a makeshift infirmary. It was a sanctuary. The men sat on the floor, leaning against her cabinets, sharing stories of the road and their time in the service, their tough exteriors melting away in the steam of the pots. Monica realized that, for the first time in years, her house didn't feel empty. She was feeding an army of outcasts, and in the heat of the kitchen, the boundaries of race, class, and fear were being cooked away into something much stronger. Across the street, through the swirling white curtain of the storm, Deborah Sloan stood in the darkness of her master bedroom, the blue light of her smartphone illuminating a face tight with indignation. To Deborah, the sight of 30 motorcycles half buried in snow outside Monica's home wasn't a sign of a crisis, it was an invasion. She didn't see the limping man being carried inside or the desperation in the biker's eyes. She saw a threat to the neighborhood's order, a violation of the quiet she felt she had purchased with her high property taxes. With a sense of self-righteous duty, she dialed the emergency line, her voice trembling with practiced alarm as she reported a gang gathering and illegal activity at the Reed residence. But the world outside was no longer under the jurisdiction of the city's rules. The dispatcher's voice was weary, drowned out by the crackle of radio interference and the sounds of a city in chaos. "Ma'am," the voice responded, "we have 300 car pileups on the interstate and a precinct roof collapsing under ice. Unless there is active gunfire, we cannot dispatch a cruiser to your sector. Every plow and emergency vehicle is stuck. You'll have to wait until the storm breaks." Deborah lowered the phone, a cold knot of genuine fear forming in her stomach as she watched the silhouettes move behind Monica's thin curtains. For the first time, she realized she was just as trapped as the woman she despised. But while Deborah sat in her silent, cold mansion, clutching her phone like a useless talisman, Monica was across the street, presiding over a room full of outlaws. Monica heard the distant, muffled sirens of the city's main arteries, realizing they were the only sounds of civilization left. She knew Deborah would have called. She knew the police would have come if the world hadn't turned white. The realization brought a strange, terrifying clarity. There was no authority coming to save her, and no authority coming to arrest her guests. The social safety net had vanished, leaving Monica alone to manage 30 of the most feared men in the state. She looked at Frank, who was now resting fitfully on her floor, and then at the men who were watching her for their next cue. The invisible woman was now the only leader they had. She wasn't just a mother or a struggling cook anymore. She was the warden of a sanctuary, holding the line in a neighborhood that the rest of the world had forgotten. By the third morning, the sky had finally exhausted its fury. The oppressive violet clouds broke apart to reveal a sun that was brilliant but lacked warmth, reflecting off a world that had been smoothed over by 3 feet of pristine, deceptive white. Inside the kitchen, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the lingering warmth of the gas stove. Frank Donovan was awake, sitting propped against the refrigerator. He was pale and moved with a grimace, but the fever had broken, and his eyes, clear and sharp, followed Monica as she moved through the room. The departure was as quiet as the arrival had been violent. The bikers moved with a coordinated, respectful efficiency, digging their machines out of the drifts with makeshift shovels. There were no loud goodbyes, no grand speeches. The men who had spent 48 hours sleeping on Monica's floor and eating from her meager pots simply stood, adjusted their heavy leather vests, and looked at her with a profound, silent recognition. One by one, they filed out into the blinding light, their boots crunching heavily on the frozen porch. Frank was the last to leave. He leaned heavily on the man who had held his hand through the first night, but he paused at the door. He didn't say thank you. The words seemed too small for the life she had handed back to him. Instead, he reached into his vest and pulled out a circular piece of embroidered fabric, a genuine Hell's Angels death head patch, the colors vivid against the drab kitchen. He placed it on the scarred wooden table next to a thick, manila envelope that hadn't been there a moment before. "For the hospitality, Monica," he rasped, his voice a low vibration. "Nobody bothers you now. Nobody." After the roar of 30 engines faded into the distance, leaving the street more silent than it had ever been, Monica stood alone in the center of her kitchen. Jasmine was still asleep, curled in her nest of blankets. Monica walked to the table, her hand trembling as she touched the heavy envelope. It was unsealed, and when she peered inside, her breath hitched. It wasn't just a few crumpled bills. It was a dense, organized brick of cash, hundreds and fifties, more money than she had seen in her entire life. She sank into a chair, her eyes welling with tears that she had refused to shed during the storm. The patch sat beside the money, a silent promise of protection from a world that usually only offered her judgment. She looked out the window and saw Deborah Sloan peering through her blinds, watching the empty street where the outlaws had stood. For the first time, Monica didn't feel the need to hide or turn away. She held the parting gift to her chest, realizing that while the snow had cleared, her life would never look the same again. The invisible woman had been seen by the very people the world told her to fear, and they had left her with a future she finally dared to believe in. The morning air was crisp and deceptively still, the kind of quiet that follows a historical upheaval. Monica was in the kitchen, tentatively mapping out a new grocery list with the funds from the envelope, when the vibration began. At first, it was a subtle tremor, a hum in the floorboards that she mistook for the house's aging furnace finally kicking back to life. But the hum deepened into a rhythmic thrum, and the thrum escalated into a bone-shaking roar that rattled the dishes in the sink and the glass in the window panes. It sounded like a localized earthquake or a storm that had decided to return not with ice, but with fire. Jasmine ran to the window, her small face pressed against the glass. Monica followed, her heart hammered against her ribs in time with the outside noise. As they looked out, the end of the street was swallowed by a shimmering metallic tide. It wasn't 30 bikes this time. It was a river of iron and chrome that seemed to have no end. 2,000 motorcycles, their engines creating a physical wall of sound, turned onto the narrow residential block. The street, once defined by its neglect and the silent judgment of neighbors, was suddenly transformed into a sea of black leather, polished steel, and the unmistakable red and white colors of the Hells Angels. The sheer scale of the assembly was breathtaking. The line stretched back as far as the eye could see, a disciplined, thundering procession that demanded the attention of every living soul for 10 blocks. Deborah Sloan was out on her porch, her face frozen in a mask of sheer terror, her phone clutched to her chest like a useless shield. But the riders didn't look at Deborah. They moved with a singular, unified purpose, their formation tightening as they approached Monica's modest house. The lead rider, a mountain of a man with a graying beard, raised a gloved hand, and as if by magic, the 2,000 engines cut out simultaneously. The silence that followed was even more deafening than the roar had been. The street was packed curb to curb, a massive, silent congregation of outlaws standing guard in the middle of a suburb. Monica stepped out onto her porch, her breath hitching as she saw Frank Donovan. He was standing near the front, looking stronger than he had 3 days ago, flanked by a phalanx of brothers who looked like they were ready to go to war for the woman on the porch. The neighborhood hadn't just been woken up, it had been reclaimed. The invisible woman was now the center of a universe made of iron and loyalty, and for the first time in her life, Monica Reed didn't feel like a victim of her circumstances. She felt like the queen of a very powerful army. The heavy silence that followed the cutting of 2,000 engines was broken not by a threat, but by the rhythmic sound of heavy boots on pavement. Frank Donovan stepped forward, no longer the dying man on the kitchen floor, but a messenger of a new reality. Behind him, dozens of bikers began unloading high-end industrial kitchen equipment from a fleet of support trucks, stainless steel prep tables, a professional-grade range, and boxes of top-tier ingredients. They didn't ask for permission. They moved with a silent, respectful efficiency, transforming Monica's modest home into the headquarters for Monica's hearty soul. Monica stood on her porch, her hand over her mouth as she watched her dreams being built in real time. This wasn't just a donation. It was an investment in her worth. The gray-bearded leader approached her, handing her a folder containing the deed to her house, paid in full, and a business license that Deborah Sloan could never contest. "You kept us alive when the world was cold, Monica," he said, his voice a low rumble of respect. "Consider the debt settled. You're under our colors now." Across the street, Deborah Sloan stood paralyzed on her manicured lawn. The police she had tried to summon were nowhere to be found, but the community she had tried to exclude was now standing in her face. She watched as these men, whom she had labeled as monsters, gently high-fived Jasmine and helped Monica carry the new equipment inside. The sight of the neighborhood children coming out to marvel at the bikes, and the neighbors who had long ignored Monica now approaching with curiosity and awe, shattered Deborah's carefully constructed wall of isolation. She was forced to witness the birth of a foundation built on a love she didn't understand. As the sun reached its zenith, the street was no longer a place of silent wars and hidden poverty. It was a festival. Monica fired up her new stove. The blue flames steady and strong, and the scent of her mother's spices began to waft through the open windows, drawing everyone in. The bikers stayed long enough to ensure the foundation was solid, leaving behind a neighborhood transformed. Monica looked at her daughter, then at the bustling kitchen, and finally at the open door. The invisible woman had disappeared, and in her place stood a pillar of the community. She realized that while she had sheltered 30 men from the snow, they had sheltered her from the world's indifference, proving that when you plant seeds of kindness in the middle of a storm, the harvest is enough to feed a city.